The Daily Wire is a right-wing YouTube channel made up of political commentators, including Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh, and Andrew Klavan. They each have their own show where they commentate on various different political topics and current events. For this video, I'm going to focus on a video made by Andrew Klavan from episode 922 of The Andrew Klavan Show, where he discusses why, quote, Democrats hate God, end quote. A few things that I would like to note before I start. The first is that this monologue he has on his show ends up being more about there not being a separation between church and state, rather than Democrats being against God or hating God or something. The second is that this is only one segment from his entire show. So this is only one part of episode 922 that speaks on this topic. However, I'll link the full video in the description if you're interested. Because of the obviously controversial opinions of the Daily Wire, as shown in the comments, mostly comes from due to the amount of ads that have been showing up on YouTube for this channel, I wanted to do my best to take an objective look at what Andrew Klavan is actually trying to say and applying. I hope you enjoy it. Andrew opens the video with the Supreme Court case of Espinosa versus the Montana Department of Revenue that was decided in June of 2020.
There was another important Supreme Court decision yesterday in which John Roberts was the swing vote. This one refuses to allow the state of Montana to provide a tax credit scholarship program for private schools while excluding religious private schools. That's called a Blaine exclusion, and they were originally created to stop the spread of Catholicism. Roberts wrote in his decision, quote, a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they're religious.
If you're confused as to what he's talking about here, here's some background information on the case because he doesn't provide a whole lot here. Espinosa versus Montana Department of Revenue is a Supreme Court case that ruled 5-4 and resulted in the conclusion that once a state distributes public scholarships to private schools, it must not discriminate against religious private schools. Majority opinion states that it is unconstitutional because it mainly targeted Catholic schools, and that goes against expressing one's belief inwardly and one's belief outwardly by not being able to go to a religiously affiliated school due to the lack of scholarships available for lower income families. Dissenting opinion states is that it is not the government's job to fund privately owned schools, and funding privately owned religious schools with public funds is an entanglement of church and state. Andrew is in favor and agrees with the majority's ruling on this case. He strongly disagrees with Sonoya Sotomayor's point about the ruling hurting the economy's commitment to the separation of church and state. He responds to this claim by Sonoya Sotomayor not by responding to this case in particular, but by saying that in the United States, the government has no obligation to the separation of church and state.
Now, in dissent, all the liberal justices opposed this, and in dissent, liberal justice Sonia Sotomayor brought out the big leftist lie. She says the decision weakens this country's long-standing commitment to a separation of church and state, and the leftist press, of course, echoed this. Oh, church and state, the separation of church and state. This is a big leftist lie. This country has no commitment to a separation of church and state, neither written nor implied.
He goes on to further explain that the establishment clauses which inhibit the government to form a state religion represents a commitment which ensures that the government does not favor one religion over another.
The Constitution's Establishment Clause, which forbids the formation of a state religion, represents a commitment to ensuring that the government does not favor one religion over another, which is a very different thing. The founders did not mean for prayer to be banished from public meetings or from schools. We know this because on their watch, there was prayer in public meetings and in schools, and there was public funding of religious schools too, as Roberts points out in his decision.
Then we finally get into his reasoning for why the left hates religion.
So why is the left so hostile toward religion? Why are they so desperate to tamp religion down? Well, it's because the founders did not want government to support one religion over another, but they did recognize God, and not just any God. They recognized a God with a very specific nature. The founders' God was a God who endowed individuals with rights, which it is the purpose of government to secure and which government can't transgress. The founders' God is inherently at odds with government's natural tendency to grow. Divine providence, the divine providence mentioned in the Declaration, will not condone and will not protect actions against the rights God gave, which include the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As George Washington said, the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. The founders' God outranks the government. That's why the left hates him so much. The founders weren't trying to protect the government from God. They were trying to protect our worship of God from the government. That's the truth, as opposed to the left's lie.
In short, what he's saying here is the founders' God outranks the government. That's why the left hates them so much. And there is no separation between church and state because the founders were not trying to protect the government from God, they were trying to protect our worship of God from the government. So that was a lot of stuff, and I can see how it would be fairly easy to get lost in Andrew's rambles here. So let's break it down his main points in conclusion. Premise 1. The United States has no obligation, either written or implied, to separate church and state. Premise 2. The United States Establishment Clause does not separate church and state, but inhibits the government to favor one religion over another. Premise 3. The founders recognized a specific God that endows people with rights, which the government has to secure. And his conclusion, the left hates God because he transgresses the government. So, in response to Andrew's first premise, there are many instances within the Constitution that imply a separation between church and state. While Thomas Jefferson was president, Baptists wrote to him worried that, as a minority religious group, they would be discriminated against. Jefferson then literally wrote back, quote, "The legislation shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall between church and state." Further, the No Religious Test Clause in Article 6, Clause 3 of the Constitution states that no religious test will be required as qualification for any office or public trust. For another example, the United States ratified a treaty with Tripoli to secure commercial trading rights to protect American ships from pirates. In Article 11 of this agreement, it states, "As the government of the United States of America, it is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion, as it has itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of the Mussulman." And finally, just by looking at the First Amendment, we can see this quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." So just by taking a look at the very First Amendment in the Constitution, along with various other examples, we can see that Andrew's point isn't really substantiated by much. In response to Andrew's third point, I would not agree with treating the Founding Fathers as a unitary thing. Each and every one of them had their own faith, and three of them, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and Benjamin Franklin, were deists. If you're unfamiliar, deism is the belief that God created the universe, however, he does not interact or involve himself with humans. This belief alone goes against Andrew's point that they all recognized a God that endowed them with rights which the government had to protect, because according to deists, all that God endowed them with was the world itself. In saying that the God they recognize endowed them with rights that the government has to secure, he is undermining his own definition of the Establishment Clause, where he states that the function of the clause is that the government cannot value one religion over another. And for his conclusion, I really don't have much to say yet, other than the fact that even if all his points were valid or at least remotely correct, they still would not support his main point that the Democrats hate God or are against God or something. However, after a brief intermission, he has a few more things to say. Andrew then goes on to state that it does not matter if the God that influenced the Founding Fathers is deist or Catholic or Protestant or anything. What matters is that they were influenced by Christian thought within the society they grew up in.
Let me just go back to this for a minute. This God that the founders believed in, I mean, this is really important because I'll tell you why it's important in a second. It doesn't matter whether this founder or that founder was a Christian or a deist or even an unbeliever. They were shaped by hundreds of years, by centuries of Christian thought. They were all shaped by centuries of Christian thought. The deists, the people who didn't believe, the humanists, they were all shaped by Christian thought and Christian ideas.
Finally, Andrew makes some seemingly out-of-place odd claims that because God endowed us with reality, we have a responsibility towards it. This is a very vague claim that leads him eventually talking about transgender rights.
And the reason this matters is because God, in the Christian theology and Judeo-Christian theology, man was made in God's image. And that means something. That means our internal sense of things, our conscience, our sense of truth and beauty are not disconnected from God's creation, right? The things that we see and the things that we react to not only can be connected to reality, they have to be connected to reality. It's an entire concept of what is going on inside you. Your conscience is responsible to reason. Your reason is responsible to reality. Reality makes sense. Your conscience has to make sense. But your sense of things being right and wrong is your first guide, and that's how reason reacts. Reason is speaking to your conscience. And the reason this matters, one of the many reasons this matters, is because It means that your internal life, once it's governed by reason and reality, once your internal life is governed by reason and reality, is sacred. It is your version of the image of God, right? And this is what, when Christianity started to lose its grip on common culture, which was about in the late 18th, early 19th century, this is why the philosophers started to say, well, how are we going to preserve what Christianity has given us, this sense of humankind? And this is when they started to talk about freedom, about the fact that my inner life can't interfere with your inner life. My outer life can't interfere with your inner life. You have a right to say what you want to say. You have a right to worship God in the manner that you please. You have a right to do the things that you think are conducive to your happiness without stepping on any of mine. And if you pay attention to what's happening with the left, you will see that they're not only in opposition to Christianity, they're the opposite of Christianity. Judgment without forgiveness, cries for the rights of some over others, and cries for benefits of some at the forced expense of others. They hate God because they're not just trying to get rid of him. They're in actual opposition to the things, the ideas that God sent to our founders and that they put in our Constitution. It is not an unreligious document. The founding documents, especially the Declaration, are not unreligious, and our ideas are not founded in anything except Judeo-Christian and classical thought. So the point about reality, this is the thing. We know, I mean, this is my problem with transgender activism, all right? I'm just using it as an illustration. My problem is not that there are people who feel like the opposite sex and they shouldn't be bullied. We know that because Jesus tells us to take care of the people who are outcast, to take care of the people on the margin. He tells us to love them and be kind to them. We know that. But we also know that the inner life as depicted in Christian and Jewish thought as an inner life responsible to reality, is an inner life responsible to God in conversation with reality. Wordsworth, the poet, called us co-creators. We're co-creating with God out of the reality that he made. And that's why with transgenderism, we can't say that a transgender woman is a woman, which is to say that a man who believes himself to be a woman and a woman who believes herself to be a woman are the same thing. That makes no sense. We're responsible to reality.
He claims that we cannot in good faith say that a man who says he's a woman and a woman who says she's a woman are the same, disregarding the fact that his point completely disrespects transgenders by calling someone who identifies a female as a man. This point seems very out of place. I don't want to get too into it because it's completely off topic, but he's clearly just conflating sex and gender. In response to his first point about the founders being influenced by religious thought, well, yes, the founding fathers did grow up in a society that was influenced by religious values and thought. However, that does not inherently make them religious. And second of all, that does not inherently make the Constitution religious. Let's just look at a practical example. If you grew up in a religious household and you're agnostic or atheist now, you can see that just because you grew up in a religious environment does not make you religious for the rest of your life. And vice versa. If you grew up in an agnostic or atheistic environment and now you're Protestant or Catholic, you can see that just by virtue of you growing up in an atheist or agnostic environment does not render you atheist or agnostic for the rest of your life. And we can see this with many of the founding fathers themselves, holding fairly secular beliefs such as deism and separation of church and state. However, they likely grew up in a religious family and environment. For another example, let's look at a modern day one. Let's say an Islamic immigrant from the Middle East moves here, and eventually they get political power and propose a law, and it's written into place by Congress. Do you think that just because that person is from the Middle East and was influenced by Islamic thought, does that make the law that they impose inherently Islamic? Of course not, and I don't doubt Andrew would agree. Finally, when Andrew makes the absurd claim that no other entity other than religion influenced the Constitution because the Founding Fathers grew up in a religious and Christian era, influenced by Christian thought, couldn't you apply the same reasoning to the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment era was from 1715 to 1789, which encompassed the Founding Fathers' entire lives and the birth of the United States itself. You could make an argument using the same logic Andrew's using, that the Constitution was an inherently Enlightenment document because the Founding Fathers were influenced by Enlightenment thought. Although I doubt Andrew would make this point, since the Enlightenment posed many values that contrasted Christian ones, such as many advancements in the hard sciences. In conclusion, despite Andrew's reflections, I suppose you could call it, I still don't see his point. In his thumbnail and in his statement at the beginning, he claims that, for some reason, Democrats hate God, and even if we are extremely charitable and just assume every single point he says is true, that still doesn't prove some weird conspiracy that all Democrats are out to get religion. This especially doesn't make sense when you look at the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, who is Roman Catholic, and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, also the thumbnail of the video, is also religious. So I think if Andrew wants to prove something like the thumbnail and the title are saying, then he needs some different points rather than pivoting to whether or not there is a separation or obligation to keep church and state separated, because even if he's right about there being no separation between church and state, that doesn't say much in regards to proving Democrats hate God or something. Well, that's all I have for now. Thanks for making it this far.